Well, as the outsider here in this conversation, it's been very sad to see the different approach to the world. China has engaged with the world in more ways than it has in the last decades, sometimes in ways that are perceived as a threat to democracy and traditional Western powers. The United States has been pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, out of the Paris Agreement, out of the United Nations within parts of it. And Ezra Vogel, you talk about the Fulbright program. You say our Americans sent to China by the Fulbright program have done a marvelous job at establishing academic relationships and making important connections. That's now under threat as well. But I want to speak to a broader issue on education, because many students and many of your own students will be worried about where they're going to become the fall, not only Chinese students, but foreign students, international students as a whole, and of course, American students who don't know whether they should be packing their bags and going back to school in a couple of weeks' time. I mean, what do you tell them? Because this situation is still very fluid. We're speaking on July 28th. There have been some chop and changes in the last couple of days as well. What do you tell your students?
Well, first of all, I don't have students now because I've graduated and have retired. But I tell my friends who are students that it is a very fluid situation. The coronavirus, even without the foreign student situation, is very uncertain. And whether we will have classes where students will actually assemble and be together, whether small classes will meet or large classes will meet, or whether everything will be done by Zoom, even those things are very uncertain. So then the question of the foreign student becomes very complicated. Or you take even American students who are abroad now. Can they come home? Or can they carry on their education by Zoom? All these things are very much up in the air and it's very uncertain. What I tell my students is that even though our country has taken a very bad policy, that our educators have fortunately been very united. And immediately the presidents of Harvard and MIT immediately tried to figure out a way to stop the effort to make it more difficult for foreign students to come. And they had very strong support from American universities. Part of it is financial, of course. The Chinese students pay a lot of tuition and are very helpful. A lot of them are very important for research laboratories. But a lot of it is because we believe in international education. We think it's good for our country to welcome students from all over the world. They have free discussions about all kinds of issues, and that we want to take a welcoming position. And we think it's good for our country, and we think it's good for the world. So I think what I want to do when I talk to students from China is to reassure them that even though there are some crazy people in the government, and there are some crazy individuals at universities, that overwhelmingly the American people are welcoming and want to make our universities attractive for Chinese students.
Professor Tia, let's find out what's going on in Beijing, where you are. As we said, you're the Dean of International Studies at Peking University, one of the world's leading educational institutions. The pandemic is not a United States problem, it's a humankind problem, and it impacts the Chinese people very deeply as well. There are cases resurging over in China. There is no guarantee, and there's every likelihood that this is going to reoccur in the next weeks or months, as it has done all around the world. I mean, where are your students at right now, even if they're not traveling abroad, even if they're staying at home in China?
Well, during the last semester, most our students basically stayed at home. They take classes online, and they even took thesis defense online. So a lot of work was done online. But probably next semester, if the situation improves, then we can have face-to-face classes. But it's a challenging time. We don't know when the coronavirus problem will be resolved. We are hoping that a vaccine would come out, but it will take some time. But China's situation has improved a lot. But then we are surrounded in a world of pandemics going on. And also there are sporadic outbreaks of coronavirus pandemic in China in different places during the past months. So life is still difficult, but it's improving here. And with regard to the exchanges, I think we are doing I think we are going to do something online as well. Every year we send a lot of students overseas to study. Some on a long-term basis, others on a short-term basis, like 6 months to a year. But then I think in the next year, I think probably some students would have to take online classes rather than going physically to the countries they are supposed to.
So I was going to ask you whether educational exchanges, which are this great backbone of the US-China relationship, whether they're going to become a thing of the past or become less of a factor in the relationship. But do you say then, therefore, Qingguo, that online exchanges may replace or may make up for some of the physical exchanges that we're limited by because we can't travel, because we are still waiting for a vaccine and other public health measures to contain our own outbreaks?
Well, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think this is the most efficient way for us to continue exchanges. But I think after that, we still need to send students overseas and receive overseas students to have an in-person relationship. I think that relationship is very, very important. I myself is a product of this kind of exchange. I went to the US in 1981 and I did my PhD there. I forged great friendships with a lot of people there. And I think I understand the US much better just because I was physically there. If I was just taking courses online, probably I wouldn't get the same kind of level of understanding. So I think in-person exchanges are very, very important. I hope that the current US policy of discouraging foreign students, especially students from China, would change in the days to come. And I believe that it is in the best interest of our two great countries for us to carry on that kind of exchange.
Well, you were both in each other's countries at seminal points in their history. Professor Vogel, you mentioned it was 1973, in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, when you first visited China, just a year after Richard Nixon went on that historic visit to Beijing. What was China like in 1973?
It was extremely poor. It was very closed. People were afraid to talk with Americans. There were almost no cars, and everything was very carefully scripted. And yet I could feel among the Chinese academics that we met that there was an eagerness and a hope to get exchanges started. There were a few people in 73 who had, like Zhou Peiyuan at Peking University, who had been in the United States in the 1930s and who still had contacts. And one could just sense their eagerness of wanting to get something started. And we felt the same way in the United States, that a small number of our delegation from the National Academy of Sciences have had contacts with some Chinese scholars. And so they're very eager to resume them, the contacts. And it's very good for international science, it's very good for friendship, but it was unfortunately not to be. I mean, some of them had hoped that by 73, things would really begin to open up. But it turned out that it wasn't until after the third plenary in 1978 that relations really began to open up and exchanges really began to blossom. But one could just sense that to many people who had had those opportunities to study in the other country, knew each other, it was good for everyone.
Well, 1978, as you said, was when China opened up and when it began its reforms. And very soon after that, Qingguo, you first went to the United States to study, which means that you would have been one of the very first Chinese students to go to America after the competitive examinations had restarted after a decade of absolute chaos in mainland China. I mean, what did you find when you landed at the airport? And which airport did you arrive at? Which city?
New York, Kennedy Airport. Yeah, that was an experience. I was there. I did not know what I was going to face because no Chinese students have been there before me after the founding of the PRC in 49. So there was no example of Chinese students graduating from US universities. So I was very much scared in a way. But it was a very interesting experience. Yeah, people were very nice to me. And also, I think the study opened my eyes. I found we are people sharing a lot of common interests in curiosity in a lot of things. So it was a good experience. Yeah. Of course, at that time, physically, in terms of living standard, the U.S. Situation was much better. In terms of housing, food, almost everything. But China has caught up in many ways since then. But I think as human beings, we still share a lot of things in common. And those things have not changed.
The reason why I ask you both about your earliest experiences is because this, for you, I know, is not an academic discussion. This is a relationship that impacts yourselves, your families, your friends, and your students, and all them together. So it's an emotional point of discussion as well.